Hello, everyone. This is Ludmila. I am a U.S. qualified lawyer in the UAE with a fairly lengthy and substantive legal practice in this country. I have been practicing law in my own law firm under my own name for the last 14 years. So, what I'm here today is to talk about the UAE domestic workers law. And the reason we're doing this webinar or doing this presentation is because, first of all, because the UAE has a very clear legal framework on domestic workers law, and second of all, because of the nature of the industry that we're in, being the legal industry, we receive a lot of questions and a lot of interest from many domestic workers in the UAE trying to understand what the laws are in this country, what the legal framework is, if at all. And it's with that objective in mind that we thought we will just do one presentation that outlines the legal framework of the domestic workers law in the country and the very specific practical tools and ideas about what can be done for those who find themselves in an unfortunate situation where they either feel abused or they feel disillusioned about their position, or they feel lost or ignorant about what can be done about their position, or in many cases feel trapped trapped. And this is basically one of the permeating perhaps concerns that we hear quite regularly from a lot of domestic employees, where they say they don't get paid or they don't get their time off or they are abused by their employers, and they often believe that they have no recourse, that there is no option for them. And we try to respond to as many of those requests as we can. But we thought at this point, because also the UE legal system and the practical tools have evolved so much over the last several years. So we thought we will put together a comprehensive and a visual guide to what the law is, what the practice is, and how those who want to either learn or educate themselves about the law here, or even more so to do something about enforcing their rights, can do. So that's sort of the purpose of this particular presentation. So now, with that in mind, what we will be talking about today is ultimately sort of what this law is, who it applies to, and what can be done in terms of enforcing one's legal rights in this country in light of perhaps their interest in moving on to a different employment or just leaving the country altogether. At a high level, there's a very specific law, and the law, by the way, is that we're going to be talking about today. It's a new law. It's the UAE Federal Decree Law number 9 of 2022, and it's basically the law that says regarding domestic workers law. This law was introduced just in September of 2022, and it will become effective as of 3 months from that date, which is December 15th, 2022. Importantly, this particular law replaces a previous law on domestic workers, and that was law number 10 of 2017. So for all of those who either want to cite the law or to understand the law, to read the law, make sure that if you are going to be referring to the law, it should be the new law, which is dated 2022, because the previous law 2017 has been altogether replaced by this new law. But also at this point, it's important to highlight that until 2017, there was no specific law on domestic workers. For all those who do not know, so the UAE has the private sector, has the government sector, and the private sector employees are covered by the UAE labor law. Now, domestic workers are not included or not covered or subject to the UAE labor law, nor were they subject before. And until 2017, there was no specific law that actually they were subject to. And they were expressly excluded from the employment or the labor law, but there was no specific law that would cover them. In 2017, that was changed. There was a specific and very tailored law was introduced to cover domestic workers. And since then, now the law has further evolved, and now we have the version from 2022 that specifically covers domestic workers. So this is an important distinction, that it's the laws and the rights that apply to domestic workers in the UAE are not part of the UAE labor law, but rather the specific domestic workers law. Now, what we'll talk about today is, so what is a domestic worker? Who qualifies as a domestic worker? And what evidences or proves that an employee, in fact, is a domestic worker in that very specific definition. And then we'll talk about the governing authority, the licensing authority that governs domestic workers, and also the types of employment, how domestic workers can be employed directly or indirectly. We'll also walk through a number of useful apps and technological tools that are now available for domestic workers to be able to learn information and also to apply to enforce their rights. We'll talk about reasons for why one may want to terminate a contract and how to do it. And we'll also talk about some high-level tips that are important for domestic workers to keep in mind as they go through the process in order not to jeopardize their rights in the country. We'll also talk about amicable termination versus contentious termination, because it is always possible to ultimately decide and agree with your employer that you don't want to work for them anymore and to amicably decide on separation. But in most cases, and perhaps this presentation in particular is tailored more for those cases where there is no opportunity for an amicable termination, it really more goes into the area of contentious dispute resolution and then ultimately court. We'll also talk about the various steps that are required to be followed for the purposes of dispute resolution, and the differences between formal and informal steps, such as just calling the authorities versus actually filing with the authorities. There's also an important issue to discuss, and that is that of filing a complaint or not being afraid to file a complaint with the police, especially for those who find themselves being abused, which is often the case. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about and showing the tools that exist, the online tools that exist with, in particular, the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization, which is called MOHRE. Which is the governing authority and the licensing authority for work permits, and is the necessary step prior to filing a formal court case. And we'll talk about ultimately if the dispute resolution or has not been successful through MOHRE, what needs to be done in order to file a court case and how that's done. And also what kind of documents and what the process that needs to be followed if you decide to proceed with a court case. Then we'll do a quick summary of some of the tips that we will have talked about in the presentation for those of you who want to who kind of want to understand the big picture and the big takeaways. Now, all of this and the purpose of this presentation, once again, is done with the idea of giving you the tools to be able to help yourselves. So although we will talk through what effect I'll be talking about is proceeding with a court case, many people feel very uncomfortable, understandably so, of filing a court case, let alone doing it themselves. And it's understandable, and this is exactly why this presentation is important, is because it does not need to be the case. You don't need to be afraid to file a court case, and it's for a number of reasons. One, because the UAE has a very clear legal framework to protect domestic employees and ensure that their rights are protected and enforced. So the law, the legal framework is there. Also, the practice is there, and that is the courts are there, set up to especially help domestic workers. And all that is now being offered by virtue of many, many, many online tools. And it's through these online tools or these technological tools that you ultimately can help yourselves and file your own court cases without having to pay for a lawyer, or to have to pay money for somebody to even do it for you. A lot of these things you can't do on your own, at your own fingertips. And so this is important, and this is why we want you to have these tools at hand, so that you know that it's accessible to you, and it's very much effective, and therefore you should not be afraid to stand up and try to enforce your own rights. Now, you'll see on this slide that if you want any particular topic, to understand any particular topic, so the slide numbers are here listed for you. So if you want to learn more about how to the court fees, you go straight to slide 31. If you want to understand, for example, what amicable termination is, you go straight to slide 11. So this is done for you to help you navigate through the presentation more efficiently. Now, let's talk about who are the domestic workers. So as per the UAE domestic workers law, there's very specific categories in terms of professions that fall into the domestic workers. And they are housemaid, sailor and boatman, guards, stablemen, housekeepers, nanny, farmers, physical labor worker, personal family drivers, cooks, tutors, falcon caretaker, yeah, that's a very UAE specific profession, gardener, personal trainer, interesting, a private nurse, and personal assistant. So any one of these designations that you see on this slide are in fact listed as domestic workers as part of the UAE labor law. So therefore, you don't necessarily, so let's say, and you could be hired as a private nurse. If you are being you can be actually hired to take care of somebody and be on that family's domestic worker visa, versus, for example, being registered as some other employee of some other clinic and then provide services to the home. So you can be actually licensed by that specific family for that specific, let's say, nursing position. Now, what this means in particular is that for many domestic workers who are in the UAE, they may think that they are domestic workers because they live in the house and they take care of the house and they provide one of those functions or those other roles that were listed in the previous website slide, and that is, for example, a gardener or cook. But yet, what makes them subject to the domestic employment law, which is the subject of this presentation, is for them to actually be registered in this country as a domestic worker, which means they must have a proper contract for domestic worker, and it's a standard contract. And that is, and the visa ultimately will also be issued that's a UAE residence visa, as a domestic worker visa. And so, and this will all obviously be reflected in your passport and your Emirates ID. So just because you work as a gardener or a nurse or a cook, for example, at a family, does not necessarily mean that in legal terms you are subject to the domestic worker law. And this is because it is often practiced in the UAE where, for example, you may be working as a cook in the house or as a nanny in the house, but in fact, you're under a visa of your employer's company. So not under the visa of your employer as a domestic worker, but let's say an employee of your employer's company. So this is very different. And the reason that particular practice exists is because it's a lot cheaper for an employer who has, let's say, a company, let's say a business in a free zone, for them to sponsor an employee because they can do this for 3 years. At least in the past, they could do it for 3 years. Whereas if you just get a domestic worker visa for expats, it's only 1 year. So it's actually cheaper and a lot simpler and more efficient for employers to sponsor their maids and their nannies and their cooks through their companies versus directly under them as employers of domestic help. But in the event you are one of those. It's important to highlight that this particular domestic employment law that I'm talking about here today does not cover you. So you will not be subject to that law. In that case, you will be in fact subject to the UAE labor law, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation, because you are, in technical and legal terms, you're considered to be an employee of the private sector. And therefore, as an employee of that free zone, for example, or an LLC company, if you are an employee of an LLC company, you are considered to be an employee of a private sector, and therefore subject to the labor law and not this domestic worker law. So remember that, and that, by the way, could be to your advantage for a number of reasons, because your benefits could be better under the labor law, because it's set up more to work or to provide benefits to the private sector, the corporate world, versus to sort of the domestic help. So there's some different benefits. But at the same time, it can also land your employer in trouble, because that's not, technically speaking, that's not a proper arrangement. So for you to be working as a domestic help for somebody while not being on the domestic worker visa, in fact, is a liability to both the employer and to you as an employee. So be mindful of that. And if you do find yourself in one of the situations, if you think you're domestic, or you're being treated as a domestic worker, but you actually have a different visa, for you to file a court case, let's say for termination of the contract, a different process will have to be followed, one for the private sector and not the one we're going to be talking about in this presentation. Now, those of you who are domestic workers, I'm sure you've heard the word tadbir, and it's often a very much misunderstood term. What is tadbir? Many things that they employed by tadbir. Many think that tadbir is kind of the court and the government all at the same time, and this omnipresent authority that sort of governs all domestic employees. What I want to highlight here today to sort of clarify that the tadbir is really just a licensing authority. So it's an offshoot. It's a government authority, but it's a licensing authority for recruitment agencies for domestic workers. So what it does, it gives out licenses to all those recruitment agencies who hire domestic workers. So it licenses them, and it ultimately is supposed to regulate them. So that's one of the purposes of tadbir. And the other one is that also it kind of acts as a middleman, if you will, to help domestic workers, to register domestic workers who are employed by individual sponsors. In other words, it's like almost like a typing center from the Ministry of Human Resources or Immigration. It's a middle agency that represents or that helps register domestic worker with both the UAE government, both from the immigration standpoint and from Ministry of Human Resources standpoint. So for example, if you're a domestic employer and want to hire someone, your tadbir is the one who will give you the agency that will have that standardized domestic worker agreement, which I mentioned earlier, the domestic contract. So they will have, tadbir will have that standard agreement, and they will register that agreement, and ultimately will facilitate issuance of the visa for the domestic worker, all through this agency tadbir. But it's agency is an authority ultimately, but they are not your employer. This is important to highlight, because many think I'm employed by tadbir. No, they truly are just a middleman. They're just an agency that facilitates relationships between domestic workers and employers. Now, how can you be employed? There are different types of employment for domestic workers. One way, you could be employed by an individual sponsor. So let's say me, I am a mother and I want to have a nanny. So I hire a nanny and she is under my sponsorship. So in that case, in her visa and in her contract, I, as Ludmila, will be listed as the employer in my individual capacity, and on the nanny's residence visa, in the passport, it will be issued an employee of Ludmila. So that's called an individual sponsor relationship. And by the way, it's important to clarify that relationship exists and has always existed, because often we hear that somehow both employers and employees, or domestic employees, are being told that this particular arrangement is not possible. You cannot be sponsored or employed by an individual sponsor. It has to be done through a recruitment agency. That is not the case. And the domestic employment law is very clear that there are two types. So there's several arrangements. One is you can be employed by just an individual person, or you can be employed through a recruitment agency. Now this and the recruitment agency can play sort of two different roles. One way is that an employer, for example, a family like me, can go to a recruitment agency and hire a recruitment agency to help me find and perhaps even train a nanny before I hire her. But ultimately, so I pay money to a recruitment agency to help me source a nanny and vet her and maybe even train. And then once I've decided to hire her, then she will be hired by me, and I will be her, once again, her sponsor. In other words, I'll be her employer, but there is a role of a recruitment agency before then, by virtue of them assisting me in finding the right agency or the right employee. And then the third type of employment is when a recruitment agency actually hires the domestic employee. So they are under the sponsorship, under the visa of that particular recruitment agency. So, for example, let's say Maid CC is one of recruitment agencies. So those recruitment agencies, they have the ability to hire these employees, and they're under their sponsorship, and then they contract them out, for example, to individual employers like myself. So let's say in this case, I want to hire a nanny, but I don't want to put her under my visa for a number of reasons. I just, or maybe even sometimes want a temporary help in the house. So I will go to this recruitment agency like Maid CC. I will pay them a fee, and that nanny will come to my house and work in my house, but she is, technically speaking, not my direct employee. They are the employee of the agency, and my relationship is with the agency, and I pay that agency the fees, and then the agency pays the nanny her salary, and it's the agency that's responsible to the nanny in terms of all the other benefits and all the other obligations that otherwise employer is required to follow in this context. So there are a number of very useful UAE government applications or apps for domestic workers, which is very important, and I want everyone to familiarize themselves, because they are truly lifesavers in many ways. So one is the GDRFA, and that's the General Director of Residency and Foreign Affairs application, ultimately immigration app. And these are all, by the way, government apps. So you can really avail yourself of services, of these government services, just by virtue of these apps. And in many cases, you will need to use them in one way or another. So the immigration app, for example, if once you're properly licensed in the UAE as, let's say, a domestic employee, you will be able to find your profile in this GDRFA app, and you will be able to even file a copy of your contract, because they think of it as like a centralized portal of information, government information, that keeps all your data, immigration data, in the country. So GDRFA is a great app and a great source to refer to, because you can find even a copy of your passport, a copy of your residence visa, a copy of your Emirates ID, and you can even make certain requests for services through this app. Also, one of the most important apps that I highly recommend for everybody to activate is the UAE Pass. The UAE Pass ultimately is your UAE government password, if you will, for all sorts of government services. So it becomes your own identification or a password to be able to access all types of government services. To activate your UAE Pass, you need to have Emirates ID, and if you are properly licensed domestic employee, you will have an Emirates ID, and through this Emirates ID, just by virtue of downloading this UAE Pass, you'll be able to activate it. And from there on, let's say if you wanted to log into any of the other government apps, such as Tadbir or GDRFA or Mohre or the police app, it will prompt you with an option to log into any of those apps vis-a-vis your UAE pass. So instead of having a separate login number and such, a UAE pass becomes that for you. So, and it's a face recognition, so it's sort of eye scan and so on and so forth. So it's a pretty sophisticated tool, and it allows you basically, if you, let's say you want to go onto the Mohre app, instead of putting in every time your name, your password, your OTP, and so on and so forth, all you can do is that there's an option there, log in through the UAE pass, and then the UAE pass automatically pulls up, it scans your face, and then it verifies you, and then it opens up this portal for you into, let's say, the Mohre universe or the GRF universe. So, and that through that, because it's such a highly verified tool, you will find yourself sort of having this access into the government database of all sorts of information that pertains to you as a person in the country. And then, so Tadbir also has its own app. This is also very useful for those of you who want to kind of to navigate, for example, what type of agencies exist, recruitment agencies which are licensed, which are not licensed, and other basic information about Tadbir, where they're based and how they work. It's the Tadbir app. One of the most valuable apps for the purpose of this presentation is Mohre, and this Mohre stands for Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization. That's the licensing authority for all employees in the UAE, apart from free zone employees. And so we'll talk a lot more about the Mohre app as we go through the presentation. And then finally, the police app is also very important. And I'll tell you exactly why, because a lot of the things that we find, a lot of the issues that we find the domestic workers face in the UAE, in fact, should be reported to the police. Now, most of the cases that we see and we hear and we sympathize with, they have to do with ultimately domestic employees not being happy with their working arrangements. And they're not happy for many reasons. Some of the reasons for domestic abuse. And domestic abuse, by the way, it comes in many shapes and forms. It doesn't just have to be physical abuse. It could be psychological abuse. It could be financial abuse. It could be moral and mental abuse. Any type of abuse is considered to be a domestic abuse. And by the way, in the UAE, it is criminal. It's criminal to abuse people. So, and there are a number of laws that clearly or criminalize this kind of behavior. There's a criminal law. There's also domestic employment law, specifically spells out that these are all abusive and illegal practices. And then, by the way, as I said earlier, there's very specific law that clearly sets out that any kind of even psychological abuse and mental abuse and monetary abuse, these are all considered to be, in legal terms, abuses. And anything related to domestic abuse, obviously, is the jurisdiction of the police. So it's criminal in nature. That's why you should not be afraid to report these kinds of abuses. Some of the other complaints, and often complaints, is holding the passport. A lot of the time, employers of domestic employees or domestic workers hold their passports, and they take the passports on some pretense. Oh no, legally you cannot have your passport. Legally, I'm entitled to keep your passport. That is not the case by law. And it's very specific also in the domestic employment law. It's very clearly spelled out that the employees or domestic workers have the right to all of the identification documents and only. So that's your legal right. So the employer has no right to seize your passport or hold any other identification documents, such as, for example, your Emirates ID. So all those documents, the passport and the Emirates ID, must be on you and must be within your custody, because you're entitled to by law. A lot of the complaints have to do with inhumane conditions. The domestic employees often find themselves being mistreated in all sorts of ways. For example, they are not allowed to have any time off. They're not allowed to sleep, or they are being housed in sort of rather inhumane conditions where there'll be 10, 12 people per small room in bunk beds, or they're not being fed, or they're not being given clothes, appropriate clothing, or they're not allowed to sleep enough, and so on and so forth. So that too. And so that's one of the reasons why you may want to leave that particular employment, and either seek a different employment or go home altogether. So, by the way, the UAE domestic law is very clear that these kinds of activities are illegal. It's illegal for employers to abuse you. It's illegal for them to hold your passport. It's illegal for them to provide you with inhumane conditions. The law is very specific about what the employers are obligated to provide to you as an employee in order to be able to be treated humanely and legally. One of the other complaints, very typical complaints, non-payment, and non-payment comes in all sorts of shapes and form. One of which is employers just don't pay salaries because they're saying, oh, well, we'll keep the money for you for safekeeping because you may lose it. We hear these kinds of cases quite often. Sometimes there are a lot of deductions. Oh, because you were sick that day, so therefore I'm deducting this from you. Or you didn't work very well that day, I'm going to deduct this from you. Or I had to pay the agency fees for you, therefore I'm going to deduct this from these agency fees or recruitment fees from you. Or you broke something, I'm going to deduct this. And so at the end of the day, employees often don't have, often receive a fraction of their salaries that they should be receiving at the end of the month, if at all. And we hear cases like this all too often. And once again, the UAE employment law, the domestic employment law is very clear that all of these practices are illegal. They're against the law. Employers have no right to deduct any kind of amounts unless, for example, it's for a loan where employer actually gave you money in advance and that's documented. And even then they can only deduct about 25% maximum of your monthly salary. So they cannot ultimately leave you with that salary on a monthly basis. That being said, all too often we hear cases and complaints where domestic workers work from day to night, and at the end of the month, all they get is so-called shelter and food and no money at the end of the month. So there also could be reasons for wanting to leave because there's some other type of breach of contract. For example, the employer does not allow you to take your holiday or does not pay for your ticket home. And or does not give you the day off that you wanted. So that's called a breach of contract. And as I said earlier, the contract in the UAE for domestic employees is standardized. It's standard. So the terms are pretty clear. And in that contract, it sets out when what your salary has to be, when your holiday is for the term of your employment, and so on and so forth. So anytime your employer does not follow any of the terms in the contract, so they are ultimately breaching a contract, and that gives you the reason to want to terminate. And sometimes and often employees want to leave employment just because they have a better opportunity. It's just because somebody pays better, maybe better conditions, maybe easier work, maybe more enjoyable work, and so on and so forth. So there's this too, by the way, is a very equal legitimate reason to leave employment of one employer and seek better employment elsewhere. So any one of these reasons obviously is a reason for termination. And by the way, in the UAE, including for domestic employees, you can always terminate your employment. It is not true that you are not allowed to terminate just because you signed your contract. That is not the case at all. You can always terminate your employment for whatever reason. It just becomes a matter of compensation and how you do it. So now in terms of terminating employment, and there are two types. One is amicable and one is contentious or non-amicable. And so amicable is easy enough when you decide I don't want to, let's say I have a better opportunity, somebody else pays me more money, and if your current employer does not want to match that salary, they just said that's fine, maybe you're good, maybe you're worth it, but somebody else will do the same job for less money. So thank you very much. You can go. I will find someone else. And that happens often enough as well. Or you can say, listen, I want to now take care of older kids. I don't want to take care of smaller kids, or whatever other sort of legitimate reason. So and ultimately your employer agrees to part ways. So that's called an amicable termination. And in this case, it's there's still a process that needs to be done to do it correctly, but ultimately this should not lead to the court, and it should result in cancellation of a work permit rather efficiently, and ability for you to apply for a new visa to work for a different employer. That's sort of how it's supposed to happen. For this, if you do want to leave your employment and you hope that it is going to be on an amicable basis, you do still need to communicate. And you need to communicate clearly. So that means you need to resign. You need to submit your resignation. Resignation could be just by email, it could be by WhatsApp, but it's better. It's better to have something a little more official, such at least an email. Dear employer, I wish to resign, or I not to renew the contract, or I want to resign early. For whatever reason, if you want to mention a reason, but definitely make sure that you have some document that shows that you have submitted your resignation, and that also that you've offered to serve your notice. But most of the cases, and this is perhaps the reason for this particular presentation, involves cases where amicable resignation or amicable termination is not an option. The employers don't want to pay that salary, don't want to pay, for example, the time off or holiday or ticket home, or they don't want to increase the salary, or they don't want to provide better living conditions, and so on and so forth. So that's called a contentious dispute, or it's a dispute, a contentious termination, which means the parties ultimately are not in agreement about parting ways. So some high level tips, whatever it may be, if whether you are resigning amicably, or you're upset with your employer and there's no opportunity for amicable resolution, you still, at no stage should you just be running away. Don't just run away, because that can land you in all sorts of unpleasant waters, such as, for example, there could be an abscondment, there could be some accusations that you stole something, and you may be banned from coming to the country. And so just whatever you do, don't just run away. And just keep in mind that if you have reasons to leave, you can leave, but just do it correctly. Don't just disappear, which is often, by the way, the case. And often that happens because employees feel, or domestic workers feel, that they just have no other option, that their employers are abusing them so much or disrespecting them so much, they have no other option. But whatever you do, don't just run away. Either if you are being abused, report it to the police or to the authorities, or report it to Mohre, so that at least there is document or evidence that the reason why you were leaving the premises. So you can also, for example, if you're being abused, you can report it to the police, but you can also go to the CDA, which is the community center for abused people. So it's called a community development authority. So it's CDA. So you can also, but whatever it is you do, at least have some kind of record with some government agency that you've reported the reasons for you leaving the home. So if you do have amicable termination, we mentioned earlier, as I said, submit resignation, however it is, that should be at least an email, some kind of record, and then make sure to serve notice. Now, this means that by default, by that standard contract that I mentioned earlier, there's a 1 month notice, which means you can't just pick up and leave. You have to at least offer the employer to work for a month, after which you can then legally leave the employment, or you can offer the employer that basically to pay for that 1 month notice period. Instead of working for the employer, you can just offer them compensation for that month. Let's say if your salary is 3,000 dirhams, you say, okay, I don't want to work. I'm giving you 1 month notice, but I don't want to work for you during that 1 month, but I will pay you my 1 month salary, which is 3,000. However, what's important to highlight here is that you don't have to serve your notice, for example, if you're not being paid. So all of this is predicated on the fact that the presumption that your employer is complying otherwise with their obligations under the contract and the law. So therefore, if you're not being paid or if you're being abused, you're not required to continue to subject yourself to abuse or continue to work for free. So you only want to serve notices. Ultimately, say, listen, I had a good employment, thank you very much, but I want a better job, or I want to go home and I just want to terminate. So I'm giving you my notice, but that's predicated on that you are continuing to work and that you are continuing to be treated in line with the UAE laws and the contract. And then once you have served your notice or you paid for your notice, make sure that before you leave your employment, and in particular before you start working for somebody else, that you have your visa properly canceled. And then that's before you start working for someone else. So this is really important. So if with this amicable termination, don't just treat this, oh, okay, well, the employer said, yeah, it's okay, you can go, so therefore I go and work for somebody else. No, do it properly. So have the resignation, serve your notice, and then make sure that your visa is canceled before you apply or before you start working for somebody else. Obviously, you can apply beforehand, but before you start working for someone else, make sure that visa is canceled and you have a new visa before you start working for someone else. So do things right in order to avoid penalties or fines or perhaps even deportation altogether. Now, in most cases, we're talking about, unfortunately, where this kind of amicable separation is not an option. So in that case, let's say your employer not paying you salary or not giving you a holiday or not allowing you to take your day off or not paying your ticket home or abusing you or not or making you do work that you're not supposed to be doing. For example. So whatever the reason may be, or you just want to leave, you're just done for whatever reason. So what you do first is that obviously have a conversation with your employer, but sometimes it's not possible. It's easier said than done. If you feel intimidated and harassed by your employer, which often happens, it's difficult to have that conversation. What you can do, then you can and you should report your complaint to MOHRE. MOHRE, again, is the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization. Now, to report your complaint, you can do in one of two ways: either through website or through the app, the MOHRE web app or website. This is the high level sort of picture. Now I'll explain to you shortly each one of these steps. And so that's if you want to, if you want to talk about your employment relationship and ultimately terminate your employment relationship, you will have to move through MOHRE. And then MOHRE, as I said earlier, it's a licensing authority. It's a governing authority. It has some limited power to be able to resolve certain disputes, but ultimately, if you have an actual dispute about the payment of your or non-payment of your salaries or termination of contract and such, it may have to go to court. And so, but before you go to court, you do need to go through MOHRE. And you need to go through MOHRE in terms of the various sort of specific procedural steps. And then because MOHRE, ultimately, the objective of MOHRE is to try to serve kind of as a mediation authority to try to resolve this dispute before it goes to court. And so if the dispute is not resolved, which is in most cases the case, it's not often resolved through MOHRE. In that case, you will ask the MOHRE from an NOC. The NOC stands a no objection certificate, which is a ubiquitous term that's used in the UAE kind of as an approval or from an authority to allow you to kind of move on to the next step. So if MOHRE not successful, then you will request ultimately NOC to go to court. We'll delve into the process of how to file a complaint through MOHRE and through court shortly, but this is kind of a high level overview. In addition to, or alternatively to filing with MOHRE, you can file with the police. So for example, if you're being abused, you can file with the police, and that, or if you're being accused of something, but this is basically abuse. Perhaps is the most common reason to file with the police. The police too has its own app, as I mentioned earlier, and that you can do just from your phone. So, and that's the beauty of technology and the gadgets in the UAE becoming the smart government or e-government, and certainly COVID has helped in that regard quite significant in the last 2 years, in so far as the governments have embraced these many different technological tools, and they're now available to all of us at our literally our fingertips. So if you have a phone, in most cases everybody has a phone, you have a download a Dubai Police or wherever Emirates you are app, and you can report. And these apps are designed in such a way that you can actually report these abuses right there in real time. So you can do a video, you can do a photo, you can upload the photo, you can just document, you can just file a complaint. And that's, by the way, is really good to do if something like this is happening. If you're being beaten, for example, assaulted, which sadly and tragically happens all too often, or if you cannot leave the house, if you're not allowed to leave the house, that's also not allowed. That's called kidnapping. So these kinds of actions or transgressions you can document through this app. And it's, by the way, really good because in either the police will get involved and they will come and visit the house, or alternatively, or in addition, you can use that evidence from the app later on to use in the court or with Mohre to show that, listen, you were abused and you reported the abuse, and perhaps the police even opened a case. But even if it didn't open the case, if it didn't go anywhere, then at least you can show that you have filed a complaint like this. So don't be afraid to file with the police. I know there's a lot of people are afraid, but this is, but the system is there. The laws are there. You're not, all you're doing is trying to enforce the laws that this country has in place to protect protect people like you in these kinds of situations. So don't be afraid to use the app, and it's quite easy to use. A lot of the services are available in English, so it's fairly self-explanatory. And so once again, in terms of the order of actions, depending on your situation or your circumstances, either report with the police first, and then with that evidence, or alternatively, you file a complaint with Mohre. If your employer is not complying with your wishes or or with their obligations under the law or the contract, and then ultimately, if Mohre is not successful in convincing the employer to, let's say, comply with their obligations, such as pay your salary or allow you to take your day off, then you will, or cancel your contract, for example. If you just want to cancel the contract and you want to leave your employment, then you will request from Mohre NOC to go to court. So this is the high level sort of steps for how you must move through the process in order to to end your employment relationship with a particular employer in the UAE and to do it right. So wanted to take the time to highlight the fact or the differences between just calling the authorities and filing a complaint, because often we hear from domestic workers, oh, I called Mohre, or I called the police, or I called the court and they told me this and that. Well, it's very different calling the authorities versus filing complaint. When you call the authorities, depending on who you can call immigration, you could call Mohre, and they will give you some level of advice, but all it is informational advice, is informational guidance. It can tell you, yes, you can do this, you can do that, or this is they're not allowed to do, or this, or you have to do that. But ultimately, it's not a record of any point. It's just an informational source, and nothing more than that. So don't rely on what you're being told as, for example, some kind of evidence or expectation that something will follow from that. Nothing will follow from just a call to the authorities. One, and two, also be mindful of the advice that you're given, because it may not always be sort of appropriate to your particular circumstance. It could be just purely because the person on the other side does not have the full circumstances of your employment relationship, and they're giving you just the general tidbits of advice, but they don't necessarily pertain to your specific circumstances, because they don't have that same background or documents that otherwise would be relevant to make a proper decision. So it is not just enough to call and expect that somebody will do something. If you want an actionable process, you must file a complaint, be it complaint to the police or the complaint with Mohre, and ultimately complaint with the court. And if you do file, and so ultimately what you're looking for is that if you do file, go through the process and go through Mohre and then the court, you will have a court judgment. And this is when now you have an enforceable instrument. So now with that court judgment, you actually can either request for your employer's bank accounts to be seized to pay off your judgment, for example, or for the authorities to get involved and get your passport retrieved from the employer, and so on and so forth. But you do need that court judgment. It's with that court judgment then ultimately authorities, all sorts of authorities, immigration authorities, police authorities, and court authorities, and then can act on your behalf to ensure enforcement of your rights and benefits. So as I said earlier, if you do want, what kind of cases you will want to report to the police, it's the physical abuse or mental abuse. The police has its own app, which is there on the screen. That's the Dubai, those of you who are based in the UAE would know that we have 7 emirates, and so police services are emirate based. So depending on which emirate you're in, here on the screen you see the Dubai Police app, and that's what it looks like. Ajman and other emirates have their own apps, so download those apps because they will be very useful tools for you, and kind of in your free time, just putter around the app, kind of familiarize yourself, and you will see what other services are available there. And I will tell you, and every so often revisit those apps because the services continue to improve, and more and more services are being offered. So even as I was putting this presentation, by the way, some of the things and the presentations of slides we had prepared earlier, just of last week, services have already amended. So these kinds of tools are evolving quite rapidly. So do take the time to every so often go and revisit these apps and these websites, because more and more services are being added, all with the objective of making it easier for people to get information and to be able to enforce their rights. So let's say you filed with the police, or you didn't have to file with the police because your circumstances are different, but you ultimately you want to terminate your employment. You just want to leave, and you want to leave, for example, either because you're being mistreated and or because you haven't been paid your salary. So when you file a complaint with Mohri, you can claim both. Say, I have not been paid salary, so I want my salary paid, for example, and I want my employment terminated. So you can but you can also equally so you can just apply to have your salary paid only, and not worry about, let's say you want to continue to work for the employer, but you still just want your salary paid. It's probably unlikely that there may be many people like that, because if you're starting to file complaints against your employer because they're not paying your salary, chances are you don't really want to be working for that employer for the long haul. So what you want to do is you want to go to the Mohri either website or app. So both services, both sort of portals are available. The Mohri website is a lot more comprehensive and a lot more detailed and has more services available than the app. The app also is useful, but it has more limited functions for the time being. But once again, that's one of those examples where the apps and the services continue to improve. So it may be that with time, the app and the website will be basically more or less mirror of one another. But for the time being, for the full spectrum of services, you want to go to the Mohri website. And for more limited services, you would use the app. So you go to the Mohri website, and then you'll see there in one of the tabs, it says services. Under that services, you will see services for employees. And this basically here, what you're seeing on the slide, are the visuals of the actual websites. And this is done for you to be able to have a visual, kind of a picture of what it really looks like and where to look. And you can see all these slides you're seeing right now are actually print screens of the website, the website pages themselves, and they are in English. They're in English, and they're fairly self-explanatory. And again, they're done with the purpose of making things easier for the likes of you to be able to navigate through the website and ultimately apply for the services that you want applied. So once you go into the services for employees, you go to service employees, and here it says services for employees, and there are 2 types of services for domestic workers, or 2 types of complaints that you can file. One is the domestic workers salary complaint, and then the other one is a labor complaint. And the labor complaint, as I said earlier, that, for example, you're not only are you getting your salary not paid, or some kind of deductions being made, unauthorized deductions being made, but you also just want to terminate your contract for one reason or another. So that's perhaps is in most cases you would want to file a labor complaint, not just a salary complaint, but a labor complaint. Because if you've gotten to the point where you have to go through this process, it's unlikely that you want to stay with a particular employer for the long haul. So even if they pay your salary that they had not been paying you, chances are you may not want to stay with them in the long run. So what you do then is that you go through the full-fledged labor complaint service or option. And so this is on the screen. You will see that there's in both options, you have view details, which kind of gives you a description of what the particular complaint is about. And then to start service, you click on start service. Once you do start service, this is quite important. So a lot of the times we hear from domestic workers is that they're afraid they don't have the right documents, the right information to file a complaint like this, because let's say they don't have the passports in their hands. They don't have even Emirates ID. So they have nothing with them. And so they're afraid that they won't be able to avail themselves of these kinds of services because they don't have the minimum details. However, you will see that in order to access these kinds of services, very minimal information is required. And once again, this is done with perhaps that in mind, that for a lot of these kind of circumstances are perhaps all too common. And so it allows domestic employees with very little sort of information to be able to find themselves on the system and through that file a complaint. So you go here first in order so that you have under the filing a labor complaint. I'll give you an option to put in your name, your mobile number, and then verify you through OTP. I think we kind of all know what that is. It's fairly easy to do. At this point, all domestic employees and most people here do have a phone number. It doesn't have to be any particular. It doesn't have to be your registered number. It could just be your number. You put your name, your mobile number, you verify your OTP. Once you put in your OTP, you will have this sort of screen that shows success. The OTP is verified. You move on. Now it will give you the options to enter details about who it is that you are. So here you will see on this screen and the important perhaps word to pay attention to is the or. So any one of these types of information can be used for purposes of filing a complaint. So the first option is a unified worker number. Let's face it, most of us don't know what that is, and that often scares people. But the key here is that there's always an or. It's either that, or you can just put your passport number and your nationality. The system will be able to find you through these details. Or it could be your immigration number and your nationality. You may not have that. And then, or it could be just your visa number. But again, a lot of these, the first few options necessitate for you to, if not have physical passport and physical copy of your Emirates ID, at least copies of those documents. And often that's domestic workers don't even have the benefit of that, unfortunately. So the last option is perhaps the easiest and the best, and that's the one that you kind of want to start with first, and that is so at the very end you will see again, all you can do is put your name in, your gender, your nationality, and your date of birth. And I have to tell you, we've tested this many times before. This works more or less like a charm. So once you put your name, then obviously your official name, your nationality, your date of birth, it will be able to find you just by virtue of those details. So and perhaps so here you have a visual on this slide. You have a visual of what it looks like on the website. And here's kind of a summary. So really, in practical terms, you perhaps would go in reverse. The best option is the one at the bottom, which is where you can provide just your name, your gender, nationality, and date of birth. And voila, you are able to access your details on the system. Otherwise, you can also put an Emirates ID, your visa number, or your passport number, nationality, or your worker unified number. So basically, this slide shows you in terms of the ease of entering data, it perhaps would be in reverse in terms of how you would enter your details from this particular slide. And then here, once you put in those details, it will be you'll see a tab that says employer. You'll be able to choose who your employer is. And I have to tell you, it's once you put in those details about yourself, it will show you who your employer is. And this is why, as I said earlier, it's really important. So this system works like a charm for all those who are in fact registered as domestic workers. They have a domestic worker contract and they have a visa for domestic workers. In that case, this system will pop up your employer's details automatically. So you're not expected to provide the authorities with exactly the name of your employer and the passport details and so on and so forth. That is the beauty of these technological tools, is that by virtue of entering going through these different steps, the system will find you and they find your record and will show you who your employer is. So you'll just select from the system who your employer is, and then you can file a complaint. Exactly, again, it's pre-populated. So this is quite a convenient tool, because in many cases we hear people are worried they don't know who they don't even know whether it's the father or the mother that's the sponsor, or the grandfather, and their copies of the passports, IDs, they don't have those details, or you don't need any of that. The system will automatically identify the right party for you to file a case against. So and then you go through the process of basically filing. It says here the employee file a complaint, and then you will have a complaint number, and as well as your employer's details, and it will give you the option of basically registering the complaint. And then in here you can put in sort of details of what it is that you're claiming, but ultimately you're not required to put in many details. So, because remember, this is the Mohre complaint. So here we're not at the court system yet. We're just we're just basically requesting for the authorities to try to reach out to your employer, to call in and try to resolve the dispute without having to go to court. You also have, so that was the Mohre website. Now you can go to the Mohre app. The Mohre app, for the time being, is more limited to if you want, for example, a complaint about your salary. So it's a domestic worker salary complaint. So here, once again, this is download the Mohre app. You should have it. You should make it a habit to go through and kind of explore the services that are offered in the Mohre application, because more and more, again, it's becoming more evolved and more services are being offered kind of on a regular basis. So you'll see here, there is a special tab for domestic worker, and from there you can go to domestic worker salary complaint. And so that's here, this particular service works actually quite well. It just, once again, pre-populates all your details, and you are able to, you just need to put in your passport number, birth date, and nationality. And then basically here you're reporting to proceed with the salary complaint. So there, it's almost automatic. You don't really need to even say very much. You just put your details and say, I have a complaint about my salary payment. And that's all through the app. And then you just file a complaint, and then Mohre will then communicate or reach out to your employer and try to resolve or force them, I guess, encourage them to pay your salary. So as I said earlier, what the purpose of going through Mohre is, first of all, ideally, just for them to resolve the dispute. And sometimes that is possible. They'll just call the employer and say, you have to pay the salary, and that will be the end of it. Or say you have to allow them to go on holidays, and that could be the end of it. Or you can say, listen, I don't want whatever it is, whatever they all can offer me all the money that they haven't paid me. I don't want to stay with them anymore. I want my contract terminated. So you would make that request to Mohre. Say, I want my contract terminated. And sometimes Mohre can actually do that, because they are the authority. They are the employment authority that oversees contracts. So they're not judicial authority, but the employment authority. So they have the ability to terminate your contract in certain circumstances, or terminate or cancel your work permit, for example, at your request. So what you would do is say, listen, I just want my contract terminated. And it may be that by talking to the employer says, fine, okay, we agree. So Mohre can actually get your contract terminated. And in that way, you will not have to go to court. You can just have your visa canceled. And then after that, you can find a new employment. But if that does not happen, and for whatever reason, because Mohre is telling you, let's say, oh no, you have to continue to work for them, that's not the case. So listen, whatever it may be, if you don't want to terminate my contract, that's okay. Please give me the NOC to go to court. So that has to be your objective. So if Mohre does not resolve that complaint in the way that you, the employee, the domestic worker, then they basically say, listen, that's okay, fine, you can give me whatever advice you want to give me, but I ultimately want to go to court. Because often what can happen is the Mohre representative may say, well, you have to finish your contract, which is one of the complaints we hear all the time, or you have to ask your employer to terminate your contract or to let you go. That's not the case. The law clearly gives you the right to leave. Okay. And so if Mohre does not help you terminate the contract, which ultimately they also may not be able to do because their ability to terminate contract is sort of limited within their own authority, and that's more kind of regulatory licensing authority. But if there's a dispute about sort of more substantive points, then that's the jurisdiction of the court. So just remember, this is the most important thing, is that just if Mohre is giving you advice that you don't agree with or you don't like, even if they think they're telling you you're wrong, but if you don't like it, you just want to terminate your employment, say, fine, whatever you tell me, I want to see to go to court. So your objective has to be either your contract is terminated with Mohre or you walk out with an NOC to go to court. So that perhaps this is the most important part of this presentation. Make sure that you walk out with an NOC, and they cannot refuse you with that. So kind of just again at a high level, what the purpose of Mohre, or this is basically labor complaints, they provide kind of advisory services, and they will give you some advice about this and that, but ultimately they act more as a mediator. So they try to mediate dispute between you and the employer, but they cannot adjudicate legal matters. So if the mediation is not successful, then you get the NOC to go to court. And then it depends on where you're based, which Emirates you're based. You will need to get an NOC for the particular Emirates. So if you're based in Abu Dhabi, you'll have to go get an NOC to Abu Dhabi courts. But all of this will be done through Mohre, because once again, when you file the complaint through Mohre, it's going through your centralized sort of portal of information and record as it is registered with the government. So it automatically will give you the right NOC to the right court. And all you need to do for this is that you are basically, you don't even need to have your contract or passport. But what happens in the past, these are the kind of this basic information you were required to present to the court to apply. But a lot of domestic employees did not have that information at hand. What happens now is when Mohre closes the complaint and gives you the NOC to transfer it to court, as part of that file, they'll give you your entire file. They'll give you a copy of your contract, and that part of that file, copy of your passport will also be there. Your employer's passport or the trade license will be there. And also the summary of the meeting, the mediation meeting minutes. So ultimately, you don't even really need to present any documents. So when Mohre transfers, gives you an NOC to go to court, as part of that, they'll send you an email, or it will be available on the website, which is basically a file, and that's a system-generated file with all of your employment data, with all your Emirates ID, your passport, your visa number, your contract, and the same thing applies to the employer's side of things. Also, it will be all part of this one file. So ultimately, you almost have your entire case that can be presented to the court just on the back of that one file from Mohre. So, and then once you have that, then you need to file. So then once you have an NOC from Mohre, then now you can file with the court. Now, to file with the court, you can do it in one of two ways. Either you can do it through the court login, through the court's own website, or through one of the typing centers. If you do it through the court's website, you need to have your own court login. And to do this, you need to go to the UAE Pass. Remember, we talked about earlier in the presentation about the UAE Pass. It's very important that you, for all those residents who live here, you should definitely activate your UAE Pass. With this, you will be able to register your own court access. And then or if that's too daunting or difficult, then you can go through one of the typing centers. The typing centers basically is an offshoot of the court. It's like an arm of the court that allows people to come and use the services to type their complaints through this typing center. So it's not your it's not just perhaps the name is a little bit sometimes misleading. It's not, they're not just there to type a complaint, but they're basically, whenever you go to them, they'll type whatever it is. They'll be able to find your details, and they'll type your complaint in Arabic, and they'll submit it to the court. So you can do it to the typing center or through your own court login. Remember that the typing centers, there are many different typing centers, depends on where you are, but they are government services effectively. So whatever it is you do with a typing center will go directly to the court or to whatever authorities that you need to submit. But in this particular case, it will be to the court. And depends on where you are in which Emirates. Just do a search on the website in terms of the typing centers closest to you, and that's the typing center you go to. And that's, again, in the event you don't want to set up your own court access and file a complaint through your own court website. And now to how to create a court account. And this is a quick crash course on how to do this if you want to have your own court access. So you have to register an account online through the UAE Pass. So you go to the particular Emirates court, and then it says the login, and it gives you the ability to log in with the UAE Pass. You can see there's a big red arrow. So if you have this, is the beauty of having the UAE Pass activated. So once you log in through that, it will right away basically allow you to set up your own court access and register your own kind of login details. Importantly, whenever you submit anything to the court, all the submissions must be done in Arabic, and then you have to present documents, whatever documents you present, and it also has to all be done in Arabic. So if you're presenting any documents, they need to be legally translated. And whatever it is that you claim in terms of, for example, termination and compensation, everything has to be in Arabic. And this is perhaps why doing it through a typing center is more convenient than doing it through your own court access, because through a typing center, you can just go and dictate to them what you want to put into your claim, and they will do it in Arabic. Whereas if you're doing on your own court website, through the court website on your own, through your own login portal, you need to either legally sort of do the Google Translate, which you, by the way, can also do. You don't necessarily it doesn't have to be perfect Arabic. You can just write your complaint, what you want, put in Google Translate, and then put it into the court system. But this is why but remember, nothing that is sort of submitted in English, for example, will be considered. So things that the complaints and claims and documents do have to be in Arabic. So this is very important. So what's also important is that in filing court cases for domestic employees, you don't have to basically pay anything to the court. So because anything less than 100,000 dirhams, and in most cases for domestic workers, their claims are less than 100,000 dirhams, they are exempt from court fees. So it's just, you don't have to pay. So this is to show you that these services are very accessible, not just by virtue of being able to do it online and through the apps and on the website, but also even financially. You don't have to pay lawyers. You can just go to the typing center or do it through the court website, and you don't have to pay fees to the court, because you are, as a domestic worker, for these kinds of claims, you're exempt from legal fees. So now let's say you have a court judgment, and so as part of the court judgment, and what you may want to be requesting in your claim to the court is, let's say I want termination of contract, I want also return of my documents or personal things, and I want compensation. You can want all of these things or only one of these things. Let's say you just want termination of contract, nothing else, or you just want return of your documents, or you want compensation for all the things that you have not been paid. But in most cases, it kind of involves all of this. So in your court judgment, ultimately, that would be these are the claims you would be making. And ultimately, in the court judgment, that's what you would be seeking to see. The judgment most likely will say, okay, yes, we authorize sort of termination of contract, and so here's the compensation. And the employer must return, for example, passports and pay unpaid salaries, and we deem contract terminated. So that's ultimately what you would be seeing in the court judgment. So now, just as a summary, remember, so the types of termination of employment, it's either amicable, you shake hands and you go separate ways. But if you do that, do it right. give that resignation and then serve your notice or pay for the notice and have your visa canceled and then move on to your next employment. Otherwise, if there are circumstances where you're being abused in one way or another, don't be afraid to file a complaint with the police. The tools are there and the authorities should act. In any event, if there is a dispute, you will have to file with Mohre. If sometimes and perhaps with time, if more people will be filing complaints with Mohre perhaps with time will have more authority to resolve them and apply pressure on employers to force them to comply with the laws and terminate these contracts without having to go to court. But if that doesn't work, be prepared to go to court, get an NOC from Mohre, and don't be afraid to file your own court case. So now, in conclusion, it's really important for all those domestic employees out there to understand that the UAE does have very clear and very robust laws and legal framework and tools and systems so that sets out the rights and the entitlements of domestic employees and also protects their rights. So the legal system, the legal foundation is clear, it's there, and it protects you. So you don't think that you are not protected and that you have no rights. In fact, there's no such thing as forced labor in the UAE, and there hasn't been such thing, at least in my time here, and I've been here for 13, 14 years now. Which this means that if no forced labor, it means you can always resign. It doesn't matter for what reason. Nobody can force you to work against your will. You just need to make sure that you do it the right way, where you follow the steps we discussed in this presentation with resignation, service, and cancellation of visa, and not just run away. Because if problems start happening when you just run away. And so remember, if you are being mistreated, you can always report this. You can either report to the police or CDA, the Community Development Authority. Don't be afraid, because the laws are clearly there to protect your rights, your human rights. It's illegal for anybody to abuse you, to harass you, to physically assault you, to mentally or financially deprive you. All of these are the illegal acts under the UAE. So don't be afraid to report those to the right authorities. And remember to file a labor complaint, either for enforcement of your rights or termination of contract. You need to start with Mohre, okay? And then with Mohre, if Mohre is not successful in resolving your dispute, then you transfer the case to court. And finally, because of all these tools that I've shown to you and the specialized courts that are set up there, the system and the process of filing these labor complaints are fairly simple and straightforward, and you can do them on your own with a little bit of help of a translator or a typing center. And they are very efficient and they're accessible to all of you, because as you saw right now, a lot of these services are in English and they are free and they're all accessible to you literally at your fingertips. So all in all, the laws are there. The UAE has very clear laws about protecting and treating domestic workers with respect and dignity, and disallowing any kind of forced labor altogether. And the tools are there for you to make sure that your rights are enforced, and they are quite accessible and efficient. So don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Now that you have the benefit of this presentation, share it around, listen to it a few times, watch it, and then experiment on your own. Go to the different apps, go to the different websites, and you will see that all of these services are very accessible. And I hope that this has been beneficial and helpful to you, and that you can, those of you who just are listening to it for educational purposes, you find it educational. And those of you who actually wanted to or are looking for a way out or how to protect yourself can actually use this as a roadmap or tools to actually be able to help yourself. So with that in mind, good luck to all of you. Keep learning and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. The UAE has a very stellar legal system and services, so don't be afraid, and good luck to all of you.